ICTs for development, information and communication technologies for development. So I thought I've been working in this area for many years, and I thought I'll try to summarize how many of us view research in this space. And actually that lens ends up defining what sort of problems we consider important to solve. And so I thought I'll try to summarize different kinds of ways in which we've approached this problem in the community and myself in my own research. Yeah. Starting from the very beginning when I started working in this area from during my PhD, so that's when we had a very infrastructure-centric view of ICTD research, that we'll build the infrastructure and we let different people figure out how to use it, right? We saw that our problem was mostly just to solve the technical issues in this particular area. So at that time, we had these interesting ideas about providing internet connectivity in remote areas, and we used something called delay-tolerant networks, where we said that vehicles that move between villages and cities, they could pick up data from the villages opportunistically using Wi-Fi networks, and then when they move to the city and they get an internet connection, then they could push off many of these things. So we did pilots and very interesting technical challenges in routing, scheduling, security in such networks. But now when I think back, right, one of the big things that we didn't actually consider at that time, and which is also a view that's deficient, even in many current practices. For example, we know about infrastructures like Aadhaar and what are now commonly known as digital public goods of building large infrastructures at societal scales. So many in sort of this infrastructure view, we often don't look at this what's called the socio-technical interface. So an example over here is that we were working in the setup where we would put up, we expected that people would come to kiosks in the village, and from where the internet connectivity would get established periodically. But we didn't think much about the biases that would get associated with this intermediated use of this infrastructure. So what that means is that this kiosk is run by operators ultimately. And who the operators are, their caste background, their social standing, all of that shapes how comfortable other people feel in coming to the kiosk and interacting, and what sort of help do they expect to receive and how promptly. So it is this kind of a socio-technical aspect, and as we go along, we'll come up with many such examples, right? And then the other thing which also we didn't think much about at that time, which is again something that's deficient in ways in which technology infrastructure for things like e-governance is done in India even now, is we don't think much about the user-centeredness of many of these tools, right? How easy to use or in what sort of people might face problems in using many of these things. Yeah. So when I started at IIT, this was one of the first projects that we picked up, and this is also that my first PhD student, Zahir Kuradia, who was co-supervised with Bhaskar and Raman from IIT Bombay, this is something that he actually built. And then Gram Vaani, along with Gram Vaani, and we took this to scale. So here we picked up a very user-centered design view. So here the whole idea was something called ethnographic design methods, where we actually immersed ourselves for days at end in different community radio stations, and we try to understand what are their daily practices and what sort of challenges do they face in running these community radio stations. So just very quickly, a community radio is it's a small setup normally put up by non-profits in rural areas, where they create content locally and then they broadcast it over FM. And there were many problems, right? Problems in terms of what sort of a scheduling software they would use, how to archive content. And then more and more people were getting mobile phones, but there were no easy systems for people, let's say, to call into the station and for the radio station operator to do things like put their call on air. So Zahir and many of us in the team, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the context, and very nifty sort of engineering level methods that we developed, so that because we essentially put up a computer which had many devices connected with many different sound cards, sound card which would transmit, another sound card for previewing audio, and then a phone line so that people could call into the station. And basically this one computer was supposed to manage many audio flows at very low latency. So we had to do many tweaks and to get the technical stuff working. But more importantly, it was this user-centered view that helped us build a very successful software. And this is still running in many stations. It's in very heavy demand. We've scaled it, many stations even in Africa are using it, and it's a time-tested software, very robust. Hardly we require very little technical support now going forward. And we saw many interesting ways in which people also, stations started using it. So they would broadcast panchayat meetings live on air, where a person from the station would go into these meetings and they would call the station, and these meetings were basically being broadcast, and great efforts for transparency. But then again, this kind of a view where we were thinking of building technology which is can be used in easy ways, right? Even over here, we missed out on how was it really leading to development? We were still far away from the action. There was very little view that we had into how these stations are running, which stations were able to do something useful with it. And by and large, this also led to our own internal frustrations, where we saw many stations are using it for sort of trivial things like folk songs, and which is also relevant for community building, but not in very powerful ways that we actually wanted such systems. Right? We saw the potential in which these systems could be used. So some breakthroughs happened when this community radio area was not growing very rapidly in India, largely because of licensing issues. And then we pivoted and we started using what are called IVR, interactive voice response systems. And this became very, very successful. So these systems again want to mimic social media or participatory media in rural environments and do it in voice. So the way these systems work is that people can call into a phone number that we provide, and they can listen to audio messages, or they can also record their own audio messages. And then we had a moderation team that manages these messages, figures out which ones to publish, which ones to reject. And that we saw led to many, many interesting use cases. So people started using these systems for question answering, where they would call and they would record questions. And these questions could then be answered by experts or by other members from the same community. We also saw lots of ways in which people started using it for social accountability, where they would call and record problems or grievances they were facing with government schemes. And because these grievances were now going on air on a public platform after they were published, it put pressure on the authorities to work better, right? So this kind of an action, what's called an action research view, where we said that we won't stop just at technology, right? But as we went forward, right, we built up a field team that figured out how to take these systems to more and more remote communities. We built very interesting content moderation processes of trying to make sure that the content is credible, it's understandable, it's relevant, it's spoken in a respectful tone. And many of these processes around social accountability. So this kind of a view where we went a lot beyond just the technology in terms of understanding the socio-technical interface, that was very, very relevant. And I'll talk about some interesting insights that we got. When we started working in these areas, right, we recruited community volunteers who in offline ways would inform people about what these systems are, how they can use it. But as we went along, we saw that the systems began to be used more intensively by more tech-savvy users, or those who were quick at adopting technology, and which is not really what we wanted, because this is a view that the technology could, in that case, exacerbate existing social inequities when it gets used more actively by those who are already good at using technology. And we had to work hard. We had to build processes of recruiting volunteers in from a more representative class and caste background. We also figured out many processes of how to bring women into the system, because reaching women was much harder. So ultimately, we saw that this action research view, where we started working and understanding the social technical interface, really helped us understand how we could avoid amplifying existing inequalities. And so these are views that people like Kentaro Toyama, right, so one of the fantastic books to come out of the ICTD community, right, where he talks about limitations of technology, that when people build technology, it often tends to amplify existing inequalities, because it's people ultimately who have to use this technology. Those who are better off will end up using it in a better way. What we ended up contributing to this whole debate is that we said that that's fine, that's a limitation of the technology, but actually you can surmount them if you start paying attention to how you can manage the socio-technical interface in a better way. Yeah. And many such things. So, for example, I was talking about volunteers. We try to understand what motivates these volunteers. And so now these volunteer structures that we have, we started doing this Mobile Vaani almost 10 years back. And many of these volunteers have been with us right since then. They're very stable. And so what we also understood is how these volunteer incentives and what sort of processes motivate volunteers to work with each other and cooperate and stand in solidarity. And this is actually very interestingly, it's all connected with concepts like governing the commons, where Elinor Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, so she talked about many principles of how communities can build processes to govern the utilization of commons resources, common pool resources like water or forest or grazing land, where you may have heard of things like tragedy of the commons, where selfish behavior by some people can lead to exploitation of the commons by a few. But Ostrom showed that principles like when you can observe other members, when there are sanctions that are imposed, and many of these processes of volunteer management actually can go back to what Ostrom talked about. So these are actually very interesting, because now in the current context, we are seeing the management of digital infrastructure like social media platforms or like gig economy platforms, where people are recognizing that such societal scale infrastructure is currently managed by a few people or by the founders of the company. But these governance processes need to be more democratic, and workers, for example, on gig economy platforms, or consumers or users on social media, we need to have a say in how these platforms are governed. So many of these principles actually extend into some of these concepts which are becoming very active in governing what are now being called the digital commons, of how do we manage, how do we think about digital infrastructure as a commons. And very similarly, even operationally, so we...
can you click on the slide? We cannot see. This bar will go away.
If you click on it, the bar may go away.
Yeah.
No, that is screen.
No, it is.
I can see the slides. I can see the slides. We are at an action research view.
No, the bar is blocking some down.
Actually, I'm not seeing anything on my screen.
Yes. Oh, it's on there. It's on the
It's on the
big screen.
No, I don't think that will work.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
What bar are we talking about?
It's not relevant to online users.
This is only
Some people are seeing it. Great. So even in terms of operational, right, that how do we build this kind of a digital commons view where communities can manage, right? So this is again where we developed a very federated setup, where we have decentralized networks. So each district, for example, that we work with, that has its own set of volunteers with their own phone number and their own identity, and they figure out what use cases or what content topics are relevant for them and how they want to run these platforms. But it's a federated setup, so there are some common values, some common processes that we ensure are replicated across all of these instances. So these are actually also very interestingly, it's all connected with things which keep coming back, right? The notion of small is beautiful by an economist, E.F. Shoemaker, from the 1970s. So at that time, he was talking about largely things like agricultural technology, where he said that rather than have large industries manufacture technology, these things should be built using local materials and should be managed and repaired locally, so that the local communities can actually gain both in terms of skills as well as wealth through these technologies, rather than have large centralized industries which tend to suck wealth away from local communities. So the sort of digital equivalent that we've been talking about of small is beautiful is that the technologies may not be manufactured locally, right? People are using cell phones which might be made elsewhere, but these it is processes like these federated methods that can help communities govern these technologies in a better way. So it's all about decentralizing the governance, and this actually helps build the capacity of institutions. I won't talk much about content moderation, where over there also there's a lot, but basically we've built some interesting ways where our central content moderation team works in consultation with local clubs in terms of figuring out which content to publish, how to rank content, many aspects of content moderation that we see happening on social media where there are many concerns. So these kinds of methods where we manage to build the capacity of our volunteer clubs to be able to not just participate in helping solve grievances of people or help publicize the platform, but also participate in governing the information that goes on their platform. So this builds this local institutional capacity of the communities. And these become very relevant. So for example, during COVID, actually, our systems got used very, very intensely. And there was very large scale impact that we were able to bring, largely because we had volunteers on the ground who understood the local setup, who were capable, and they were able to start connecting problems that people were raising about access to food, access to cash, and they were able to connect it with a lot of local relief organizations, and we got a lot of appreciation. So, so essentially, this is a view that is saying that the technology cannot be considered in isolation. It has to be supported by people, and we have to think about building the capacity of people, and which also connects with, again, thoughts from long ago, where Ivan Illich talked about what he called tools of conviviality, that we should think about technology that actually helps build solidarity, helps people work with each other, rather than technology that sort of requires its governance to be put in the hands of bureaucracies. And that becomes limiting, because then you're actually strengthening the bureaucracies rather than strengthening the capacity of the people to govern many of these things. And then we also did a lot of work in terms of validating. So this is work largely by Deepanjan, one of my PhD students, where we try to understand why these systems, what are the underlying processes through which they are able to strengthen social accountability. So when people raise problems and these problems go on a public forum, they create pressure. But then we also build many, many methods where we also work in partnership with local media to amplify some of these issues. Or at times it is just personal relationships of volunteers with the government officials that help resolve many of these methods. Another impact pathway that is very common, which again comes from concepts that I did during my PhD, where I came up with these concepts of that when in a social network, which are clustered, right, when information is shared within social network boundaries, it improves the understanding of people because these people are similar. A concept called homophily, that these people come typically from the same income or educational backgrounds, and that's why they're sort of clustered together. And when they talk about some topic, it improves each other's understanding because it's coming from a shared context. But it is when information is exchanged across weak ties, so that diverse clusters are able to exchange information, that leads to completeness. And these are principles where even in all the topics that we cover on these kind of platforms, where we encourage people to give their stories, narrate their experiences, that actually, because we make sure that we're getting voices from diverse stakeholders, and that leads to a lot more faster ability to understand information, because they're able to get diverse perspectives as well as understand each other's context. So these have actually been validated through external evaluations. So an agency called Population Foundation actually did an external evaluation across by doing surveys across samples of over 5,000 families that they surveyed in a test and control group setting. And this paper has also been published in the British Medical Journal, which is one of the top ranking, like with an impact factor of 96 or something like that, which essentially validates that such discussion-oriented methods of creating awareness and behavior change can go beyond just purely pushing information to people so that they consume it passively. So this has also been a playground for many innovations. So this is some work we did with Chetan, where we used paper forms to collect phone numbers of people, of women in self-help groups, along with some information like is somebody pregnant in the family? Is there a child less than 6 months or something? And then we scan these forms in bulk, and we used handwriting recognition to get the phone numbers. And very coincidentally, this kind of a data collection where we collected more than 200,000 phone numbers, this happened just before COVID hit. And we were able to use this to, at a large scale, push awareness messages and other behavior change messages as well. We've also done a lot of work on, as speech recognition has improved, so we've also done a lot of work on things like automated question answering, where in many of our projects over time, we collected large data sets of question and answer pairs. Pairs of people asking questions and then these questions getting answered by experts. So these questions are coming because they're coming from the community itself. This has been very useful because they're using local words and everything, and we've been able to do a lot with that. We also worked with IIT Bangalore, Professor Prashanta Ghosh, where a lot of the audio data that was collected through our platforms, we used that to run a speech recognition challenge at Interspeech on low resource languages, and which so we got almost 24 entries of people who participated in this challenge, and the word error rates that people were able to achieve on using this local data is much better than what we get from Google APIs. Yeah. So I'll go quickly over this, but this is yet another area that I've not had a lot of time to build it up as yet. But this is a systems view, right? Where a systems view means that we think about different stakeholders who would be impacted by a technology. And I'm trying to build a view of trying to understand how this introduction of technology changes power dynamics in this setup, in this systems view, where we want to understand who gets empowered, who gets disempowered by the introduction of this technology. And that is very, very useful for problem identification. That ultimately, in a particular, if you think about in a particular community and you understand what are the power dynamics, then that can help you understand what sort of technologies to build, so that you can bring more equality in this whole setup. Yeah. So, so as you know, I also wrote a book that was published recently where I've tried to bring many of these ideas together. And largely, one of the consistent themes in the book has been comparing the kind of learnings we've had in the ICTD community and through technology platforms like Mobile Vaani, comparing them with platforms like Facebook and platforms like Aadhaar. Where we've seen how this very limiting infrastructure view can lead to blind spots. Even user-centered views can actually be very limiting, and why you need a more systems-oriented view to understand power dynamics, and you cannot ignore the socio-technical aspects when you're building technology. So, so this is something I'm trying to push forward, and also connected with design methods. So many design methods of conceptualizing problems, like participatory design, which came from the computer science community from Scandinavia by Kirsten Nygaard, and that connects with many other concepts like Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Marx, who I won't go into detail, but Marx had these methods of workers' inquiry, and Gramsci, who talked about organic intellectuals, and how these are the kind of new directions of technology design that need to be embraced, and also connected with some very tangible end goals. So one of the arguments I make in my book there is that the goal of any technology should be to remove existing structures of injustice. If the technology is not doing that, then we shouldn't be thinking about those things. And I've also built a framework where different systems can be compared in terms of their objectives, in terms of their design, and in terms of how they're managed by an underlying ethics-based view. So these are things that I've talked about in my book, and these ethics, different values can help us compare what went into the thinking behind different kinds of systems, and the intentions of the people building these systems. So that can, and these views, if they're discussed in more democratic kind of settings, can really help change how we think about what technologies we should be building. I'll talk very quickly about some work that I've initiated going forward. So now this whole philosophy of building technology, right? This resonates with what's called the commoning approach of building solidarity, building structures of mutual support. And largely, we've so far worked on the communication side of things. So two areas in which I'm now moving forward is in building technologies for natural resource management, which I talked briefly about, and then something also for building market linkages for livelihood. So actually this comes, the choice of these comes from much broader thinking and development around something called the Sustainable Livelihood Framework from John Conway, which talks about the relevance of sustainability, equity, and capabilities of people, so that they can move forward. So we're taking a community-based view of trying to build some of these concepts and do it in a way that we've done, that we build tools that we put in the hands of communities and which are governed and managed through methods, processes that we put up, governed and managed by communities, so that they can realize and achieve the sustainable rural development framework. So in this natural resource management space, right, these are all things which come from our own observations in the field, that in many parts that we're working and other parts, a consistent issue that we're seeing is with in terms of access to water. And this is being aggravated because of climate change. Richer farmers are able to dig bore wells, which are able to go deeper, but poorer farmers, their open wells have dried up, and they're able to grow only one crop in a year after the monsoons. That this, of course, creates a lot of problems. Now, solutions do exist. So things like rainwater harvesting, where water which falls as rain and which normally just flows off, you can build water structures to have this water percolate into the ground so that it improves water tables. There's also methods like tree planting, which are actually more robust than cropping and can help bring different methods for agricultural communities. But there are two gaps that we've seen. One is scientific planning, that sites that are identified for water structure, the sites that are identified for tree planting may not be done in a very scientific manner. Second problem that we've seen is equitable allocation of resources, because many of these things are actually funded under government schemes like NREGA. And over there, we see local elite capture also happening, where richer people are able to get these things done on their lands. And there's also an inclination by government officials to take the easy way out, because it's much harder to work on lands of smaller and marginal farmers. It requires more convincing, more kind of support structures. So that's where we're trying to think about what sort of tools and processes can be built so that more participatory methods can be developed. And very interestingly, these are, so I talk about, right, we want to build something like maps of this sort, which are easy for people to understand, that different areas, which areas are suitable for rainwater harvesting, which areas might be suitable for some other kind of a natural resource management treatment, but also build equity maps on top of it. So for example, maps of this sort, where we divide cropping areas into small grids. So we're planning to use something like 4-hectare grids, which is roughly like a size of land that belongs to a particular community, and then start marking that which of these patches of land belong to SC communities, which of these lands belong to OBC communities or to other forward caste communities. Because the way caste structures play out in terms of land ownership historically has been like this, that the more fertile lands, or those which are closer to water sources, were basically picked up by the forward caste. So if we have these kind of maps, that we're equity maps at the village level, that we're able to build along with some kind of scientific maps, then that can help us think about much better planning. So some tools that we've started building. So this is work that's largely been led by Chahat Bansal, one of my PhD students. That a basic building block around this is what's called land use and land cover classification. That using satellite images, we want to classify which areas have cropping, which areas have forests, which pixels have built up areas. And one thing that we're trying to do over here is, which is missing in the current products that are available, is intra-annual LULC classification, where we want to look at time series behind each pixel of spectral data to see which areas are able to grow only one crop in a year, or which areas are able to grow multiple crops in a year, right? So that's some of the things we're trying to build. And we've also put up an infrastructure for, because this requires ultimately some kind of label data, at least for validation purposes. So we've also built an infrastructure which we've now starting sometime this month itself with many civil society organizations to start providing us with some of these polygon markings along with annotations of those things. We're also planning that some of this data collection can be hard for inexperienced community organizations to do. So we've also thought of methods where we can use IVR systems to push calls to farmers who own these lands. And then through this, we can conduct surveys to collect more detailed information, things like the cropping history or how frequently is the land fallow. So this also will be a very interesting methodology, I think, that will emerge for a ground truth data collection for Earth observation data. Another project we're doing is that now with this more fine-grained land use, land cover classification, we want to see that what has been the impact of farm ponds or other kinds of water structures. So we do this by observing that in a radius around these farm ponds, how has land use changed? That earlier the land was lying fallow and now is there cropping happening? Are we going from single cropping to double cropping? Are farmers able to do horticulture over here? And then we are comparing these with counterfactuals. So similar areas in geography, a similar slope of the land, similar distance to water sources and so on, but where no water ponds were dug. And this can actually then start giving us things like the average treatment effect, where we can see that quantify exactly what has been the impact of these farm ponds. And this can also eventually be used to build predictive models. So this is where more scientific planning should hopefully become possible, that we'll be able to see that at a particular point, right, what's the likely impact if a farm pond were dug over here, based on different sorts of geospatial variables around that area. And then the next step after that is to go in for participatory planning, where we want to start diagnosing by, again, looking at, okay, yeah, just 3 minutes. Yeah. So again, just looking at how precipitation and other crop planning and forest cover have changed in a particular area, so that we can diagnose what's the right kind of a treatment. And then we want to start using these equity maps along with recommendations that are produced by some of the predictive models that I spoke about, to then build participatory tools for communities so that they can play around. They can experiment with different scenarios, that if we build water ponds over here, or if we divert some part of the land from paddy to millets, then can we bring our village from, let's say, a red marking in water stress to a green marking, right? So very simple kinds of tools, and also understand equity aspects, that earlier our village was in a red equity zone, but now can we bring it to a green zone? So these are some tools that we're planning, and this is being done by my PhD student Shivani. Another student, Ashima, is also looking at fairness in allocation of funds across villages. So this is a project we just did where, as you know, the census in India has not been conducted after, it was supposed to be done in 2021, but hasn't happened. But now what we're able to do is we're able to use remote sensing data to do what's called poverty mapping, that what's the likely indicator, social development indicator as of now, which we're able to infer from the satellite data. And these things we then want to use for auditing, that how has welfare fund expenditure been allocated? Has it been that areas which are less developed, have they gotten more expenditure? Or areas, villages which have more SC/ST population, have they gotten more welfare funds under NREGA? So that's an auditing that we want to do, and eventually come up with some fair resource allocation algorithms, which potentially through a dashboard or something can be used by government officials. So I'll skip this, but another of my student is also looking at similar things around for forest and plantation management, where again, so in India, we now under the Forest Rights Act, communities are being given the ability to manage their forest areas, the forests on which they were dependent. But there are many tools that can help them figure out how to get the forest to grow in a better way by mapping which parts of the forest are more dense than others and using those to figure out which parts of the forest should they harvest fruits or different things from. And similarly, water management in the forest, so that parts of the forest which had been deforested, more water is channeled to those parts so that it can accelerate as things over there. So I'll quickly conclude that the broader motivation behind all this is to use much of this thinking and experience around how to think about defining the right problems to solve, how to go about thinking how the socio-technical interface should get factored into the design and management of the technology, and to essentially demonstrate that something like this can be done. Right, and much of the current practices around digital public goods, which are being followed, especially in India, we can have an alternative behind that.